Welcome back to the next video. This is video 20, and here we are dealing with some NestJS endpoints and relations. And in specific, we are making for our controller and our service for our new feature module for the blog. We made a findOne endpoint, a findAll, a findByUser, and a create. And there we always work with the relation ManyToOne. So one user can have many blog entries, but one blog entry just has or belongs to one user, and we are always returning this in the API response as inline data, so you can just work with it. The structure here is, as always, we first look at our video outcome, then we will write a user story, look at the user story for this, and then we implement the story and then we close it. Let's have a quick look at the outcome of this video. So you see here we have some new endpoints, one for our blog where we can create one. So we can just run this. As a response, we are getting the new created endpoint. And this is protected by JWT. And so you see the alpha is now the user that is provided here in this JWT. And so we return this data inline. We have a slug, a header image, publish date, created date, description body, which could be like a full HTML thing with text, H1, H2 and everything. We have another endpoint where we can get all the blog entries. So for example, now we are getting return 2, also inline with our offer, and we could also query this for the entries by a specific user by an ID. So we have just these two for a user with the ID 7, and we can just return one blog entry also with the ID 7. And we also modified a bit the user endpoint. So if I go for a user, then I get also returned all his blog entries inline. Let's have a short look at our story. Here we are in video 20, and we want to add to the blog module controller and service for our functions findOne, findAll, findByUser, and create, so that we have like the basics for the CRUD API that we need. And the story is, as a technical lead, I want to be able to add a new blog entry to my user, and I want to be able to fetch one and all blog entries so we can implement it in the next stories for the normal users in our Angular front end. Our criteria are: we want to have a new blog controller and a new blog service. We want to have a post function where we create a blog entry in relation with our user, identified by the JWT endpoint, should be JWT protected. So if I want to post or create a new blog entry, I have a JWT that I need to provide so that the API will know that I'm actually this user and that it can add this to the relation to the user to our entity model from the blog entry. And for findOne, it should return the blog entry which is identified by ID. We want to have a findAll where we return all blog entries, and we want to have a findByUser where we return all blog entries that belong to a specific user. So if, for example, my user has the ID 7 and I create with this JWT some blog entries, they always belong to me, to the user with the ID 7. And so if I now go to this endpoint and I give it the user ID 7 from me, then it should return all blog entries that I created. And of course, our API should return the alpha in our blog entry inline. So because we have our entity model for the entry, blog entry, has the alpha, which is many-to-one relation to our user. We want to return to our API it inline, so that you can just work with it. And of course, our example request should be added to Postman, so you can easily see a working example. So we move this to doing. So we can see here we are on our branch develop, and so we can go with git-flow and we say feature start and create a new feature for our video. So here we are in video 20, and now you can see that we have made a new branch based on our develop branch, and we are now on branch feature video 20. So you can see here we have our blog module that we built in our last video where we made the entities. So we have our blog entry entity and we have the interface for it, and here we have also the relation to our author, so to the user. So it's always related. So we could go now into our source folder and in our blog. And then we can go with our nest CLI and we can say nest generate controller and we name it, let's say, blog. And this is wrong and we can just rename this to controller. And we can do the same here, but for service. So we want to have one controller where we have our endpoints and one service that is handling all the logic or like the persistence and the logic that we need. So we also can rename this to service. And then we can start. So the first thing that we need, we want to end this endpoint to blocks and not to block because we're for the conventions. So we need a constructor here. And inside this constructor, we need then our blogService. This is, of course, the blogService. And you can already see, since we use the CLI, it already added our blog.controller and blogService to our blog module. And here the paths are wrong because I renamed the folder, so we can just re-import it. So you see now everything here is fine. So we have everything that we need. We have our blog entry entity with our type ORM module. We have our auth module and our user module. So we can use, for example, here the pipes or the user service. So now we can think of what do we need at first. And at first we will need a post request so we can create some blog entries. So before we can fetch something, we always need to create something. So we could just name this create, and this is of course an observable. And here we want to return then the blog entry that we created. And what is provided or what we need is our body. So in our body from the request, there should be coming the blog entry. And so this is of the type blog entry that we have specified in our model here. And we are using the interface. So we are using this. And then we can just say return this blog service. And then we need here like a create function that we need to do. And we can specify once the user because we want to store to our blog entry, not just our blog entry, but in relation, because you can see it here. We have the ManyToOne mapping, which is explained in the last video, and you will see it later in the API when we do this as Postman. It's easier to see. Always one entry here belongs to one user, one author. And one author can have many entries. So I am able, with my account, I could write a post every day or blog entry, but one blog entry always belongs to one user. So we have the create, and the second thing we want to give it is the blog entry. And how can we get the user? You can remember we have our auth module, and there we have some guards. So we have like our JWT guard that we could run here in our JWT strategy. And what this strategy does, if we let it run, it will extract the JWT from our auth header, from the request, from the as token. And then it will add the payload, which is the user. You can remember it from the JWT. We can, for example, if we log in here, see where's our login request. You see it here. And I have specified here my email and my password. I have to, of course, run the API. And if I run it, so you can see here, if I log in, then I get in return this access token. And if I copy this, you can see it here. We have like ID, name, username, email, role, profile, image. And so we can use this ID that we get here, if we run through this guard, so we can access it. So it's very easy. We can just say here const user, and this is just our request.user.user, and of course to use this we also need the add request from nest.js, and this is just our req, and so we import it, or we add this here, and then this should be fine. And so in our blog service we now need one function that's called create. Let's go into our service. Let's say we create, and it's of course also an observable. And this is from type blog entry. And we need to return something here, so this error goes away. And then what we get is we get once a user, and the second thing that we get is blog entry, which is of course a blog entry. And then we need in our constructor our repository, what we want to work. So we want to inject a repository, and this is from the type for the blog entry for the entity for our Postgres from type ORM. And so we can just say private read only the blog repository from type repository, and this is of course blog entry entity. And the second thing that we can use here is the user service. Probably we will need it. Let's see. And so the first thing that we can do here is we can, from our blog entry, if we add something, then there is no alpha set. So we can do this by just setting our user, that we extract it from our JWT token. So we import this, and then we can just say we want to probably first generate a slug. So we need another function for this. And this is pretty easy what we do here. So we get the title. So this is just to make like a human readable or for a search engine good format. And so we can use there, of course, an npm module. We can just Google for this. And we can say npm slugify probably. You can see this has a few downloads, 1 million. So we can just copy this. We can just end this. And we want to save it. And then we can just call return, and we want to make this also observable, because you see here this has just the slugify function, so we can just call this and then it does something for us. So we can just say slugify, and for this we need to import it, and we can do it like specified, and we can say const slugify is require slugify. And so we can just go for slugify, and then we give the slugify something, and this is the title at first, and later we can probably generate like a unique ID, anything, or also get the ID from our post to add it to make it very unique. So we can just with this here just generate a slug and return it. So we can here say we want to generate our slug, and then we can, or we give it the blog entry title, and then we can just pipe it and make a switch map. So we stop the ongoing observable. We are getting a slug in return from our function here. And this should be, of course, switch map. And then we can say our blog entry dot slug is the slug that we got here from our function. And then we can just save it to our database. So for this, we can use the repository, and we can just call this .blog repository and save it. And what we want to save is, of course, our blog entry. And so this should be working. And for us, so we are easy or able to get this user here, we also have to add like our JWT guard, and we can just have a look at our user controller where we use it. You can see here we are using our JWT auth guard, and this is doing our JWT strategy and adding to our user or to our payload the user. So we can just do it like in our user controller and just copy it and remove the user as user guard. We have to import it, of course, and we can import our JWT auth guard, and this works because we already imported this module in our blog module. So we could now try to add a new blog entry to our backend, to our database. So we could just run npm run start dev and wait till it's fired up. And we could go to Postman. Then for this to work, I need my valid JWT here, and I want to make a new request. For this I need authorization, I need our bearer or my bearer token. I need my request URL. You remember, we are not going against users, but against blocks. You can see this here in the code. And so now we want to add something to our body, so as JSON. And what we can provide is, we need a title. This could just be named test title. You can have a description. Just call it test description, and we can give it a body and just call it test body. And let's see if we made it. Yes. And let's try, this was a GET request, to make a POST request. So we have internal server error. Let's see what it does. Null value in header image. So we have like here some not null constraints. So we could, for example, add this how is it called? Nullable true. Let's see what happens now. So probably another publish date. Yeah, let's add this to make it a bit faster. And now, if it's compiling, let's try again. So now you can see it returns our complete the entry that we created. So we have our new blog post, and we have also our author inside it. And so we can go, you see it here, we have our author here, the complete object. And if we go into our database, we can run our query. So we select all from our blog entry table. And then we see it here. And here we have just the author ID. So this is a relation to the user with the ID number 7. So now we can make the next endpoints. And we can first save this here with create blog entry, and let's save it to our requests. And now we can make the next endpoints. So the next thing that we could probably do is we want to find blog entries. And here we can again return an observable. And here we want to return blog entries plural. So we say blog entry and we make it an array. And we can just annotate it with a get request. So then we are on blog and we just make a get to the same URI than we used for our post request, just making get this time. And then we want to return something. So for finding our blog entries, we could either return all blog entries that are in the database, or we can return the blog entries for a specific user. So we could go for a query parameter, and we could go here for a user ID. And this is the user ID, and it's of type number. Always writing this here, so it belongs here. And then we could very simply say if user ID is null, so if it's not provided or undefined or whatever, then we can say we want to return blogService findAll, because then we want to return just all entries that we find. Or else, if the user ID is there, then we want to return this .blogService.findOne. So we want to just find, not findOne, but findByUser. So all blog entries that are from a specific user, for example, my user with the number 7. So now we have to go into our blogService, and we need the findAll, and we need findByUser, and both are returning an observable. And this will be of type blog entry, also an array. This will be the same for our findByUser. So findAll, we don't need anything here, so we can just go straight up. And we can just say return from this .blog repository .find, and then we just return all the rows that we find, so all the rows that are in the database. So the second one is a little bit trickier. So what we are having provided here is the user ID, and this is from type number. And here we also want to return something. So we want to return from, and we want to use our blog repository, and we want to use also our find function. But we need some, we need to specialize it. So we want to make where. And so we want to query for our author. And there we use our user ID. So we query for all entries that are having the author, the user ID. For example, if we give him the 7, he will look in this table who has the user or the author ID 7. And what we also want to do, or what we can do, is we want to make relations. And there we have to name this like we named it in our entity, so also author. And what this does is we can make a get request to blogs, and then you see it returns all our entity here. And normally it should do this also with the relation. Let's see what we did wrong. Probably we can just, this should not make any difference, but we can go blog entries. And just return them. Let's make it a bit clearer here. So we can later then just catch the error or something if something happens here. Yeah, but normally we should return also here our relation. So let's see if we restart it. Here, so you can see it here. If we are querying just blocks, then we are going, of course, not against findByUser, but we go against findAll, where we don't have relations at the moment. So we could just add them here and could say author, and then this should also return author inline. So we can make this request, and now you see we have inline here our author, and we have here our password. This should not be here. So we can return this or remove this. In our user controller, let's go for our user entity and go to our password, then make this select false. Let's see if we get it again. Now you see we don't have it provided here. So this means if you want to get the password property from the user, you have to specify it. So the login endpoint should still work. You see it here, because there we are making this request for our validate user, and here we have on our select our password property. So this will still get it. So now we can move on, and we can also specify here to get, for example, so a query parameter, and we can get the ones for the user ID 7, which I made, so this should be the same answer. If I go for user 6, then it should be an empty array because he hasn't done anything so far. Then we need just one more endpoint to go. So this is our findOne endpoint. And this is just get, and then we want to have like a parameter, and this is the ID. And for this we just use the add param from NestJS. We go for ID, and this is of course our ID, and it's a type number, and then we return an observable, and this is a block entry. So then we can return this blogService and call our findOne function. That doesn't exist right now, but we will create it. And of course we can give it our ID from the user, from the block entry. And so we can just make here one findOne. And we are getting an ID number. We return an observable from type block entry. And so we can just say return. And we want to return our block repository, so we can go for from this.block repository .findOne, and we want to search by ID, and we can also give it here some options, so we can also add the relation and just call author. So now we can see here the block that we created has the ID 14 because I already did some stuff, like you see. So we can first save this request here, get block entries by user with query param, And then we can make another request where we just go against the ID. So we can go here against 14, and then we get this in return also with our author inline. And just for an example, so you can see, we can also make like a request against getting all our users. Let's say get all users. So you see it here, we now get our users. And what we could do here is, let's see, probably here, relations, and let's say author, blog entries, of course, and we run this request again. Then we should see that we have a blog entries here for our, where's our user 7? Send the next request, 7. Here it's not having it, so let's see where we did it wrong. Well, let's make it a bit easier. Let's go to our findOne and just specify it as before with relations. And let's say blog entries. And then we make our findOne request. We go for the user with the ID 7. And then you see we have here all the blog entries that I created. So now we want to save this request here. Get or findOne blog request. Save it. And then we save this collection here to our repository. So we export it. So we exported it, and now we can just save this all and finish it up. So let's add everything to our Git. Let's say git add r, git commit -m, and we are here in video 20. And what we did was we added controller and service for blog feature and implemented create findOne, findAll, findByUser. Did I forget anything? I don't think so. Endpoints. Let's push it to our remote repository, so to GitLab. And then we can check against our story here. So here we are in video 20. What we did, we created a new blog controller and a new service. We have a new post. Our post endpoint or create endpoint is protected by JWT, and we add this always to our user. By findOne we return one identified by ID, and with inline always our author, our user. We have a findAll where we return all blog entries. We have a findByUser, so this is done in one request. We're returning it all inline, so inside our request, and we don't have to make a second. And we have added our request to Postman, so we can save this and close it, or move it to done to the swim lane. And so we can just say here, git-flow feature finish, and close this feature, and merge it back to our develop branch. And so now we are back on develop, and now we can just push it to our remote repository, and I will merge it later.